Hello, I'm Hilton Super, the Vice Chairman of Student Group. Now, today I have the pleasure of speaking to Amir Hussain, founder, CEO of Yeme Tech and partner of ONG Capital, and also a commissioner with Yorkshire and Humberside Climate Commission. This is where we interview people who are changing the world, people that are inspiring us with their achievements, their creativity, their acumen, with the use of technology. Now, in previous interviews, we've interviewed over 300 amazing people and achieved more than 50 million views on YouTube. This interview series is in partnership with our platform's Open Business Council, a Web 3.0 based platform utilizing technologies that employ the use of truth and trust through the unique corporate digital identity, using blockchain and the deployment of data analytics, AI, and machine learning. So today I'd like to introduce you to Amir Hussain. Hello, Amir, and where are you?
Hi, Hilton, and thank you for this. So I'm in my hometown of Bradford, up in the north of England.
In terms of Bradford, middle of England, the growing north, great opportunities in terms of development, particularly focusing on the sort of geospatial-led environments and solutions that you're doing for more like regeneration. So tell us a little bit about how you started.
Well, funnily enough, it did all start in Bradford. And I have to say that, Bradford is a great post-industrial city that has had, I would say, quite a lot of challenges and decline over the last 30 or 40 years. And I think living and growing up through that, and especially growing from a minority background, living in what I would consider now to be quite a challenged and deprived place, has had a massive impact on how I sort of view the world. And I would say that, over the course of, I don't know, the last 20 years or maybe more, 30 years, there's probably been maybe 3 or 4 major master plans for different parts of the city of some scale or other. And they've never really served to turn the city around. And my feeling had always been that it didn't really reflect the experience I had of living here. It didn't encapture and support and empower the things that were already here. And it didn't sort of identify some of the real powerful anchors that made the place really, really fantastic as a place to live. And I guess the fact that we were working in architecture and urban design, I was very conscious that we had to find a mechanism that would allow us to understand that layering of what makes a community work, what its strengths and its characteristics are, that would allow us to then create something that was very, very centered on the identity and the people that were already there, and to create something that was really celebratory on the back of that. Mm-hmm. And so that was the starting point for us to get into GIS. And I have to say that, as somebody who's not a techie, I'm not somebody that's technically advanced, but I understand the problems on the ground and could see GIS as being a mechanism, a tool that would help us to evidence and to highlight these characteristics of places.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you said something very interesting in the beginning. You used the word community, which I think is very, very important. And if you look back in the history of the redevelopment of cities, even from London, from Southampton, all the way up to Newcastle, I'll give it Newcastle as an example. You had these what today would be considered charming 2 up, 2 down houses on cobbled streets overlooking on the hill. It's called the Biker District at that time, which was completely flattened for a motorway, and the remaining people were housed in tower blocks. That approach in the late 70s, early 80s essentially drove urban planning. Give us your experience of that and how it's moved on from there and the challenges that have resulted.
Well, I think the picture you painted there, I think happened to many, many cities. And I do think that the financial system of driving capital investment into creating income generating assets, as opposed to creating strong and vibrant businesses, has reshaped town centres has reshaped places. And I think to put this into some kind of context, I'm not sure if you're familiar, Hilton, with Coronation Street or EastEnders, but if you were to take the pub, the cafe, the laundrette, the corner shop out of those dramas, you'd never be able to make the drama because nobody would ever meet anyone, and you'd never be able to develop a storyline. But the reality is that's what's happened in places all over the country. All of those kinds of assets that would have driven those contact points within communities, they've disappeared. And I think it's no surprise that, the levels of loneliness, anxiety, depression have increased exponentially. And that's despite being, as a society, more globally connected than we've ever been before with social media and other forms of communication. So I believe community is at the very heart of what makes a place function, what makes it work, what leads to good health, what leads to well-being, what creates an opportunity for inward investment, what creates an opportunity to encourage occupiers to come and take an office building in the middle of town, what encourages employees to want to work in the office rather than at home. I think it's that whole sense of community. And I think it's been something that has been neglected. And I think in many places we're paying the price for that. So for us as urban designers, we recognized that there was an inherent sort of place characteristic that you could leverage if you could bring people together. And so how do you start to integrate things, not so that they're just side by side, but actually operationally integrated? And I think that, when we now see the kind of statistics that there are amongst, for example, loneliness amongst young people, and the health implications of loneliness apparently are equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. There's very, very real implications. And I think that's focused a lot of energy and a lot of understanding and a lot of appreciation that community is an important component of places. And it's no surprise that the very heart of our platform is what we call a community data platform, and it's centered on community and it's centered on the relationships. So that's the kind of, I would say, the absolute critical ingredient to making places work in almost every level.
But so what you're saying is that in building urban environments, the social aspect is very, very important. The commercial aspect is very, very important. And you've got two bites of the cherry. You've got essentially, if you're using data, you're able to identify need.
Yes.
One. And then number two is then once utilized, you're understanding the dynamics within that environment, being social, economic, or whatever, environmental, so that you can adapt the space to meet the needs of the people. Is that correct?
Yes. I mean, it is correct. I think the problem at the moment is that every aspect of whether I'm looking at ESG or I'm looking at other performance indicators, it's quite siloed. So the environmental aspect is siloed in one box, the social is in another, the governance is in another, these other sort of measures of economic performance are in others. And what this does is it, one, denigrates the importance of things like the social component of places to, I would say, a tick box afterthought that just helps to demonstrate that there's something that's done to satisfy that requirement, as opposed to recognizing the inherent relationship between a social environment that has environmental impacts, and fundamentally, for, I would say, a lot of people, there's an economic component to that. So one of the conclusions that we've drawn from our data, and what we do sort of quite strongly to try and draw these relationships together, is to understand what demographic lives in a place. What's their makeup in terms of ages, in terms of ethnicities and religions, and what are the characteristics like deprivation and crime and so on and so forth. So what are the conditions and the demographics that live in a location. The second element is then understanding what are the facilities, the assets, the provision in that area. And I would say most importantly, what are the gaps? What are the things that are not there? What are the things that are missing? So that becomes a really key component. And then to understand who are the stakeholders, who are the people in this area that are involved in providing services, activities. How do we understand who they are? How do we understand what they're doing? How do we understand what the overall proposition of this destination is, in order to be able to see the relationships between all of these factors? So once we have that, that gives us our kind of, let's call it the what. It's not the how, but it's just the what. So we have an understanding of that what. Part of driving the how is, how do we channel the activities of major anchors, whether they are big supermarkets or big stores that are in there, whether it's the corporate organizations that are in those areas that are providing some kind of data or reporting disclosure component of their output. How do we connect that to the very people on the ground who potentially need it most, that facilitates the uplift of a very targeted, nuanced aspect of the community? So it's about understanding who these anchors are and what they might be able to do to facilitate that. And for us, it's about then understanding what's the relationship between a location's fulfillment for the people that live there that underpins a level of desirability for that location. So what's the relationship between that fulfillment and desirability? How does that desirability drive demand? And how does that demand equate to value? And we've done that sort of really comprehensively, and the amount of data that we have that starts to draw the correlations becomes incredibly powerful. So that it's not just a tick box exercise for something social, but actually it's a risk management tool. It's about understanding how to avoid a declining or stranded asset. It's about understanding how to maximize your value in that location, because the demand is in your interests. So it's drawing all of those things together in a platform that allows somebody to actually understand that geospatially around their asset instantly. And that's essentially at the very heart of what we're doing.
I mean, the key thing is to get all the elements together and all the stakeholders together and create, well, you know, I think of it like micro communities within a much broader community, supported by infrastructure and assets that fulfill the needs of that community, whether it's a very young community or very old community, or a mix of old and young. And it's not necessarily, you know, the classic dormitory towns where people jump on trains and commute in and out of cities. I think that model is changing because of the nature of technology today. We're able to live and work in the same, close to each other. We don't need to have to commute long distances to be there 8 hours a day for 5 days a week. You know?
Exactly. I think a lot has changed after the pandemic. The thing is that if you're looking at the way that places perform, there's no universal standard measure to recognize whether a place performs to any given standard, whether it meets the needs of the people that are there or not, whether there is a level of saturation that's in the area. So, for example, we know the correlation between Ofsted outstanding schools and high house prices. But if we can see that we've got a rapidly growing young child population and there's only X number of places within the Ofsted outstanding school, actually that's not gonna that's a misnomer then, because chances of you moving there and getting into that school is extremely pressured. What we're able to do is then look and say, well, what's it the other way around, and say, well, where is there the least amount of pressure to get into a Ofsted outstanding rated school where the house prices are the lowest? And what would be the other indicators that would make that a fulfilling place to be? Now, if there are organizations that are investing in in assets that are related to this sector, well, it's now in their interest to support the successful uplift of schools to get to Ofsted Outstanding, because it will protect their asset value and will drive demand for their location. So they can see their asset in the context of the location score. And you see, at the very heart of this is a very big problem with data. At the moment, data comes in lots of different forms. So sometimes it's, when we're speaking geospatially, it might come by district or by city or by ward or by super output area. And these are all different measures which don't allow you to very easily layer lots of different data sets around one given asset. So if somebody has or has a chain of assets and they want to understand the location around each and every one of their assets, it's actually not an easy thing to do. The second component of this is that I think a lot of the people that sit in charge of the data, so whether they're data managers or data analysts and so on, they are absolute experts in all there is to know about data. But very often they have very little understanding of the problems on the ground that need to be solved, and so therefore don't know which bits of data. So if I was speaking about Bradford and saying, well, if you don't know what is going to drive a developer's investment decisions to make a long-term income generating asset commitment to a particular location, if you don't know what factors they're going to be looking at to make that judgment, you could be sat under all the data in the world, but you don't know which bits of data to bring forward to apply to that, to make it relevant to that user. And all of the interfaces that are available to view data are generally quite technical. You have to have a technical background to use. So we did a number of things that we think are quite subtle, but actually quite profound. One of them was, how do you consistently aggregate data around any given point so that it is relevant and consistent and legible for that same location across a whole series of different data sets? You can see the relationships between a whole series of different things instantly. We also then had to ensure that we create an interface that anybody could use. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not a techie. And that's really significant because it means I have to be able to understand it. I have to be able to use it. And if I can use it as a non-techie, then it means other people can. And that was then, again, another really key component. And then I would say that the third one is potentially different. But, you know, our experience of working with cities and working with big local authorities and them trying to do big district-wide interventions, it very rarely works and very rarely works well, because the level of commitment and level of motivation and time and capacity that these things require are very challenging. And you could see that with what happened with Oxford when they introduced their 15-minute walkable neighborhoods, and they had a massive backlash against it and all kinds of conspiracy theories. But what we sort of did was said, well, how do you support an asset owner, a stakeholder, a anchor organization to simply make their 15-minute neighborhood around them better? So how do we do this at a micro level, working bottom up? And in that way, it doesn't have the kind of imposition of policies onto people and places that inevitably happens when it comes top down. And so this allows us to have, I would say, far greater impact, gives far greater autonomy to people on the ground, and it allows us to create lots and lots and lots of overlapping, highly fulfilling locations, because various different anchors are trying to make their neighborhoods better. So that's the kind of approach that we've taken.
This is very interesting because there's really effectively two sources of data, and you made mention of the data sets that are available. They can come from local authorities, they can come from universities and other third-party organizations that are collecting data. a lot of the time, in my experience, having looked at data, it's obviously very siloed. You have to go and find it, one, and number two, when you do find it, it's normally out of date because it was part of a study that was not a study anymore. Its report has been written and conclusions made, and it's not a live, dynamic, living thing. Are these the challenges are you still facing at this present time?
Yes, it is. What we've done is been very selective with our data, and we've been very rigorous with our methodology around what data we use and why we use it. So when we look at getting a baseline understanding of a place, there are lots of open source authoritative data sets from Office for National Statistics and so on, which anybody can get, everybody can get that sort of information. There's other data that we have curated specially for us from specialist providers, and then there's extensive data scraping that we do ourselves. And I would say we've got some of the most advanced data scraping systems in the world, and we're gathering data on a scale that is, I mean, when we started out, one person said to me that, you know, you're doing something that even Google hasn't tried to do, which is essentially amalgamate all the activity data for the whole of the country. So what we've found is that if you can ensure that your data can be consistently applied across the whole UK and the world, it's the consistency that is the most important element to us. Mm-hmm. And when we look at, for example, ESG reporting now, it all relies on the organizational performance or the asset performance. And in this way, it's reliant upon the operators or the management of that organization following whatever methodology they choose to follow, and they disclose what they choose to disclose. And it's actually very hard to compare two things from different projects or from different backgrounds. And the challenge is with this, that whilst you may have people doing very good things, the ability to be able to actually measure, compare, target, contrast, and actually simulate the future becomes virtually impossible. However, if you take location performance and you choose data sets that you can consistently obtain, and you can benchmark how a location is performing as opposed to an asset, well, now you can apply that. So, for example, if I was to take the amount and quality of green space per 1,000 population, I can get an exact ratio which will tell me where the average sits, which areas are better and which areas are worse. So now where you have an asset owner that has an asset within a particular location, and we highlight that actually the amount of green space in this location is significantly below the national average for the size of the population, and therefore within our scoring matrix, for them to increase that amount of green space will allow them to increase the score of the area. And in this way, they don't just benefit their organization or their users, they actually benefit everybody around them. And so using this methodology, I believe we can drive greater change and greater impact and greater value to people that might be excluded. And also it gives us the ability to simulate which places are performing well, which are not. Areas that you might consider very high value and very good, maybe in central London or the city, actually through this measure and through this context actually don't perform particularly well. And when we start looking at how we sort of decentralize some of these things, there's an incredible opportunity here. And so I would say that our approach to this is overarching in terms of its value proposition to a local place. But in terms of that how question, the frameworks and the mechanisms that people are adopting for their various reporting standards allows us to create a mechanism to actually drive uplift and change into places.
And how much of the data that you're getting, and you alluded to some of the things that you were doing on a national scale, involves what I call public data coming from people's interaction with technology, whether it be Google Maps or
Yeah.
driving their car or using their mobile phone?
Yeah, so some of it does. I mean, so we have a lot of different data sources. And I mean, so for example, one of our asset data providers is acquiring data from the likes of Just Eat and Uber. So they use that as part of their data source. When we are data scraping activities, what we're doing is identifying all of the organizations within a location. We're identifying all of the activities that they are posting out on the internet, and we're not only scraping that, but we're then aggregating it and disseminating it and identifying, for example, what percentage of activities are free. Now, one of the things that we're seeing is that of the places we've mapped so far, that sits at between 5% and 20%. And that means that in some places, up to 95% of people are excluded. One of the things we don't have is something like attendance data, which would be ideally from sort of mobile phones or that sort of thing. And maybe that's something that we look at. But I think that most of the data that we are acquiring is open source or public. There is data that we're buying, but we're collaborating with the likes of Experian and people like that. So one of the things that we find really fascinating is Experian's business growth scores. So they've mapped the likely growth based on a whole series of factors of businesses within an area. So if we understand, well, this is your 15-minute neighborhood, within those, how many high growth businesses have you got? What does that look like for future employment? What does that look like for future economic activities? What other infrastructure would that lead to? So it's kind of trying to bring to the surface and amalgamate all of these different factors. I would say it's the methodology of the assembly of the data and the dissemination of it and the presentation of it that's really at the heart of what we do, rather than the uniqueness of the data.
Yeah. So obviously you've built up a very strong platform effectively for that whole decision making and asset management process but in your interaction with local authorities, you interact with basically the governance side of stakeholders within cities and regions. Are you seeing much more intensive engagement going forward, or is it slow to catch up the commercial world?
I think there's an appetite for this level of understanding that's greater now than certainly before the pandemic. And I think that when we've presented information back to councils, we're very often showing them insights that they hadn't realized. And that has been, I would say, really powerful and really encouraging. I think the problem really stems down to the financial position that most councils, or many councils, are in. And they're in an acutely difficult sort of situation financially. And I think that a lot of the government or a lot of the council departments tend to be quite siloed. So you can sometimes have very good interactions right at the top, at the chief exec level or strategic directorship level. But as soon as it gets into the kind of machinery, it's like walking through treacle. And in our view, the private sector has proven to be far more responsive. And I have to say that, after quite a long time in business, I believe there is a greater level of desire by the private sector to do good and have a greater sense of purpose now than I think there has ever been that I can recall. And I believe it's genuine. I mean, I think that, yes, there'll be some who are doing it because they need to be seen to be doing it. But I think for a lot of organizations, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, we're currently working with Legal & General. And I mean, I think they have something like $1.3 trillion of asset under management. I mean, they're a major outfit. But their commitment to social value and social impact is extraordinary. And it's very far from a tick box exercise. We're also working with the likes of Savills, and we're looking at Savills Earth and their impact on or the development impact on places. And so we're seeing a really strong push towards this, which is really beneficial. And I think that if this can be aligned with what councils and government are trying to achieve, I think councils and government could get a lot of what they want from the private sector. And I would say that's a large part of what we do with ONG Capital. That is that culmination as well. It's really sort of channeling institutional capital in a way that has a positive impact. So I think that there are challenges, but pause to be hopeful.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned the pandemic, and we are seeing change behavior in terms of work stroke lifestyle, people working from home, large office blocks in centers of towns now being repurposed as living work environments. Do you see that as a long-term sustainable development in terms of that shift in pattern where you now effectively, you use the word decentralizing?
Yes, I do, but I think there's lots of ways that can be done well, and there's lots of ways that it can be done badly. And so I think it's hard to make a generalization on it. But the thing is that, when we speak to developers of, say, office buildings, what they tell us is that, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, when they had an office building available to rent, the first party they would meet from a company looking at this building would be the estates director, and they'd be checking the floor plates and the sizes and the lifts and the internet speeds and so on. So now, first people they get and they hear from the HR directors, and what they want to know is, after they look at the sustainability credentials of the building, which that's an absolute given, it's a non-starter if it doesn't achieve that. But then they're looking at, well, what's there to do around here? Where would you go for a coffee? Where would you go for a drink? What would you do after work? What's the experience? What's it like being in this place? Because they've got the challenge of trying to get people back into the office and attracting people to come and work for them and to turn up and so on. So I think that's a great opportunity. I think that's a great, it's a great opportunity for grassroots arts organizations to really help to drive inward occupier interest in office buildings. And at the moment, I don't think that relationship's made enough of at the moment. And so I think there's a lot of cause to be hopeful, but I think we're still in a very uncertain time. And I think there's a lot of variables. And I think the other aspect is that there are currently, I would say, places that are very successful, which work financially, work from a viability perspective, and everybody wants to live there and work there. And they are invariably priced out of those markets because the land values in those places make it so expensive that it's hard to even be viable, regardless of anything else. And then you've got places maybe close by that are the absolute opposite, where the cost to build anything is more than it's going to be worth. And at the heart of this is the lack of investment and the lack of long-term placemaking that enables that to build. But I would say that data is causing a lot of damage to this situation, and it's actually exacerbating the problem. So if I look at Bradford, for example, and let's say I want to create a very aspirational, high quality development, be it residential or commercial. In order to get funding for that development, I have to have a surveyor who is going to quantify what this will be worth on completion. And what they do is look at the prevailing rates per square foot and simply apply that, maybe with a small margin, and say, well, because it's Bradford, we'll give you £30 a square foot, or whatever they believe it's going to achieve. And the problem is that does not take account of all of the development. It doesn't take account of where the city's going. It doesn't take account of all the opportunities. It doesn't take account of growth. It just takes the prevailing cost per square foot. It's pretty much one dimension.
No.
And that is a very blunt way of quantifying the future value of this building. And when you then look at organizations like Experian, who I mentioned, you know, we work with them, and I asked them to look at the area that I live in. I said, right, I would like you to give me the performance, the economic performance of where I live. And I live in a nice part of Bradford, I have to confess. But when they showed me the data, it was really bad. It showed a high percentage of people who are stretched on their credit cards, who are financially weak, who make sort of shopping habits that are very low value shopping choices. And it generally painted a poor picture, which means that if Costa Coffee or Nando's or Pure Gym were looking at this data, they would run a mile before opening an outlet in that location. Now, I was saying to them, well, the thing is, you know, there's some very, very big misrepresentations here, because where I live has a high proportion of people from British Pakistani heritage. Mm-hmm. They have a very different relationship with money. They tend to have a lot of cash, so they tend to keep cash. As soon as they have money, they're building house extensions and dormers and roof conversions. They buy a second and third house for their kids. They're building houses in Pakistan. The women are buying gold. So to suggest that this community does not have any financial capacity not only locks in the exclusion and polarization of that community, makes it less attractive for other demographics, but also it's a lost commercial opportunity for those businesses. So what we're seeing is that when you look at these sort of successful places that I would say are overheating and not many people can afford to live in, versus the other areas which are so stagnant that nothing can be built because it costs more to build it than it's going to be worth. And then you have all of these layers of data sets which actually suppress and lock in that exclusion. It's a very damaging scenario, which a lot of people are not really kind of conscious of, but that's the area that we sort of operate in.
That's very, very interesting, is the way in which the use of data could be detrimental to a community.
Absolutely.
And I think your example in Bradford is only one example of many.
Yes.
Even in central London and places like Newcastle. Or...
Exactly. And now, you know, the thing is that what would be the counterbalance to that would demonstrate opportunity? And, you know, and if I was to take, for example, planning applications data, well, actually where I live is significantly higher than the national average. And if you take the view that, you know, it costs a lot of money to build an extension, you know, you've got to get architects to go through all that process, you've got to have a lot of financial capacity to do that. And that is probably higher where I live than it is, you know, than the national average. So, you know, those are the kinds of ways that I think we do have to present this. And when we speak to Experian and others about this, they recognize this, and they're interested in trying to overcome these challenges. And so we believe that, you know, the data's in the hands of a select few people. The people who are handling the challenges on the ground don't realize the art of the possible, and the things that are driving investment decisions into places are very one-dimensional, I would say. And collectively, all of these things are leaving places in places that, you know, they're locking in the disadvantage of places in ways that is a lost opportunity for everybody involved.
It's very interesting because, you know, if you look at somebody who wants to be an asset owner of particular real estate development, I mean, they would be very, very keen on focusing on using your technology in order for them to be able to get a much higher return on their risk capital, given the fact that there's nuggets there that nobody can see.
Yes. So when you look around a location and you can see, well, here you've got a growing young population, you've got an increasing education level, you've got an increasing level of commercial activity. The business growth scores are showing businesses that are in a very strong position. Those are sort of some of the factors that when you start projecting and simulating this into the future, you can start to see where the really big opportunities are, even though at this moment in time, the market hasn't caught up with them. But you can start to see based on these indicators where that likelihood is. Where's the saturation point for example, doctors and schools, and how does that present an opportunity for greater infrastructure and for greater, so there's all of these sort of opportunities around the data that already exists, but it's, as I say, bringing it to the surface and consolidating it all is a really, I mean, I keep getting fascinated by things that we keep finding. It's like it's just endless. We just keep adding more and more layers.
I mean, with all the emerging technologies today, such as artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, all this data gathering capacity to not only collect data, but analyze the data. How much of that are you now integrating into your platform?
So that's at the very heart of our current development now. And it really centers on simulating the future. It's taking all of that information. It's understanding what planning's happening, what developments are happening. It's understanding what the business growth is. It's understanding what the demographic changes and increases are, and the opposite. It's just as important, for example, to understand which areas are declining, which areas have got aging populations, which ones have got, demographics that are changing that are going to cause issues for various businesses. I was speaking to somebody the other day. It's well known through the last census that there's been massive changes in demographics where there's been declining white British communities from a lot of places and increasing of different minority groups. But if you look at where you've got places where the white British community is coming down and say the Muslim community is growing up, what does that mean for Wetherspoons, for example, when they look at all of their pubs? And if you've got a growing Muslim community in an area that don't drink, well then, are you going to end up with a stranded asset there? And, so it's that ability to look into the future and understand it from a risk management perspective and from a strength of security perspective. The AI ability to bring all of that, to bring some sense to literally tons of different data sets, to be able to start to rationalize these findings. It's incredible. And we currently have the most sophisticated tool for measuring the performance of places just with what we've got. And there's a lot of algorithms, there's a lot of machine learning with literally 67 million people, 5.5 million assets, 500,000 diversity assets, and 2.8 million postcodes. I mean, there's a lot of big numbers in there. And once you start to compute all of that around any given point in order to be able to calculate how it's performing and what that number means, it's incredibly complex. But that AI part of it is really where it starts to get very exciting.
Have you any examples for our listeners of what I call a moment, like a surprise moment?
Well, I think there's so many that I struggle. But for me, the point was when I actually mapped where I live. And it's really interesting because we score against 3 dimensions. One is the general population and to what extent they are fulfilled by the assets that are there. We then identify the extent to which minority groups are present and to what extent they are fulfilled by assets that they might need. And then we have the third one, which looks at the alignment between the assets that are there and the population. So, for example, if you have no people from a Muslim origin background and there's no Muslim assets, then that score will be very high because there was no need for it. So it offsets it. Now, where I live, everybody would describe it as diverse, but actually on our system, it actually scored it as low. The diversity scored poorly. I was like, this is strange. I don't understand. And we looked into this, and what we realized, it works fantastically well for a minority that is Pakistani, British, Muslim. But if you were something other than that, then it doesn't. So if you were Indian Hindu, it doesn't work well. If you were Jewish, or if you were so what it was doing was it was actually drawing out the difference between diversity and polarization.
Okay.
And that was something that I thought, wow, that's really, because actually these are sensitive issues. These are difficult things to kind of really unpack. And when you see it evidenced, it's actually really powerful.
So, Amir, you've done some fantastic work, and you've spent some time talking to us about how geospatial data is being used in order to well, I don't say reform society, but provide society with what they need.
Yes, I think that's a good way to put it.
I'm describing it. If anybody wants to get in touch with you at Yeme Tech, how do they do that?
They can Google us. I'm on LinkedIn quite actively. But certainly there's a contact us section on our LinkedIn website. So a LinkedIn company page, Yeme Tech's LinkedIn page, also on our website, yemetech.com.
Brilliant. Amir Hussain, thank you very much indeed for a very, very wonderful hour. I wish we would have more time to spend together, and we will make some time for you again to move on and understand a little bit more about the practicalities of what you're doing and examples of what you've done. But thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been very inspirational.